Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Falcon Oil and Gas Investor Presentation. Throughout today's recorded presentation, investors will be in listen-only mode. Questions are encouraged and can be submitted at any time using the Q&A tab situated on the right-hand corner of your screen. Please simply type in your questions at any time and press send. We did receive a number of pre-submitted questions, and given the significant attendance on today's call, it might be prudent just to allow Philip just to run through the presentation before you ask any questions, and maybe some of the pre-submitted questions will guide you as well. Before we begin, we'd like to submit the following poll, and I'm sure that the company will be most grateful for your participation. And I'd now like to hand over to CEO Philip Quigley. Philip, good afternoon.
Good afternoon and good morning, and thank you all for coming. My name, as I said, Philip Quigley, CEO of Falcon Oil and Gas. We had our AGM in person in Dublin early this morning, a well-attended and a very interactive. I think it went on for a total of 2 hours. It was a super AGM in terms of the participation. So I hope I can kind of cover a lot of what we discussed and chatted about earlier this morning on this AGM presentation. I'll go through the presentation, and then, as Mark said, there'll be some Q&A that'll be pre-submitted. We'll address those. So hopefully it'll answer a lot of your questions. So just a quick kind of presentation contents, what we'll be discussing. We'll cover a lot of ground, give you a little bit of history, the background for some people new to this, to Falcon Oil and Gas, and then kind of finish up with where we are at the current drilling program and what the future might hold in terms of what kind of news flow we are expecting. So a quick recap for everybody. Look, it's a huge 4.6 million acre play that we own 22.5% of. So that's like a net million acres. It's a very homogeneous, gas-rich shale play. We've had great success on the wells we've drilled to date, and the more wells we drill, the more success we deliver. We just added a new business partner, APA, coming to the party and building the first pipeline, a dedicated pipeline to take our pilot production up to Darwin. And then we'll talk a bit more about Falcon's strategic advantage, being a non-operator and importantly owning our interest of 22.5% across the entire Beetaloo. So I'll cover a lot of background in the coming slides. Let me just first maybe talk a little bit who all our partners are in the Beetaloo. And it's not just about Falcon, obviously, we're at 22.5%. But you'll see on this slide a company called Daly Waters. That's a company backed by Brian Sheffield and funded through Brian Sheffield's fund that he manages called Formentera Australia. Formentera USA is about a $2.5 billion US dedicated fund managed and controlled by Brian and his team. And they do about 60,000 barrels of oil equivalent. So Formentera is quite a sizable entity in the US of A. And they took up their position in Australia 2 or 3 years ago, both directly through Formentera, but Brian is also a serious investor through Tambourine and Falcon and Daly Waters. Tambourine Resources, obviously our operating partner still. There's been a few changes there recently, a couple of super additions to the board. Most notably is a gentleman called Scott Sheffield, who is, yes, people might guess, is Brian's dad, but he's also the former chief executive of Pioneer, a company he started, founded, and built it up and sold it to Exxon last year for $60 billion. So that's a significant addition to the board, along with a gentleman called Philip Pace. So that was welcome to see. And then there's a change at the head of the company. There's an interim CEO. The current chairman, Dick Stoneburner, is currently running that as a dual role. And I believe they're out headhunting for and targeting, hopefully somebody with some serious US shale operating capability and experience to come on board and take over the reins from the interim CEO. And then we still have H&P, one of the largest drilling companies in North America. They're in the Beetaloo drilling the current program. Liberty Energy, again, one of the biggest frack companies in the USA as part of the team doing the fracking. And as I mentioned earlier, APA coming to the party, building this 37-kilometer pipeline to hook up the pilot production. So a great team of partners to be part of. We did announce flow rates a little while ago on our SS2H ST1 well. And these follow the well results we got from SS1H. Again, more great results. And we announced the rates at IP 30, 60, and 90. And each, strangely enough, and I don't think many people have seen this, but as the well production tests extended, the flow rate kept increasing, which is not something you often see. And I'll just go to this next slide here. That's the kind of the 90-day cumulative slide in terms of production. You might not see what I'm talking about in terms of the increase, but when you look at the last 60 days and you go, wow, that looks pretty cool. And then the last 30 days, kind of even cooler again. So what that tells us is we have a very, very robust reservoir. We have a very porous permeable reservoir. We have a very good frac design and a very good frac job going on. And this obviously lends itself to potentially, for greater and higher EURs, estimated ultimate recovery of reserves per well. So all in all, a pretty good day at the office in terms of these results. And we are now on our way to drilling the next 3 wells I'll talk about shortly. Let me just flick through those. And again, just a quick snapshot how we measure these wells and basically correlated over, effectively extrapolated over 1,000 meter. The well we drilled, the SS1H well, that was such a great well at 6.4. This well is 4.3, still a great well. Anything above 3 is good, is great actually, it's commercial. And not all wells are going to be the same. So, we hope the next wells are coming in 4s, 5s, and even 6s again. So, but all in all, a pretty good day in terms of flow rates. And every time, and all the data we've got, all is positive data, and all leads to the great commercial potential for the Beetaloo. We are now well underway in this terms of the drilling program. So they are drilling 3,000 meter wells. These are what we call, they're being batch drilled. So by that, I mean, you kind of go in and you drill the top hole section of each well. You skid the rig from one to the other location on the same pad. And then you come back and you drill the intermediate section, and then you drill out the final section in terms of the horizontal section. So it's called batch drilling. So they're all being drilled consecutively. And in a way, I guess it'll lend to higher efficiencies. Also, it'll lend to better operating practices, because you're kind of repeating the same thing 3 times before you move on to the next task. So that's going pretty well at the moment. The gas gathering and compression, which is a big undertaking in terms of how you're going to tie up all of these wells, that's ongoing as well, separate to the pipeline that APA are building. In addition, we talked about the binding term sheet for gas sales. That's in place with the Northern Territory government. So as soon as we're ready to deliver 40 million scots of gas a day, that will be delivered on that agreement that was signed last year. And then very importantly, we got native title holder approval, which is the first native title holder approval to be obtained for the Beetaloo. So that's a big milestone for all of us. We're still on the kind of zero cost exposure by participating or not, as the case may be, going from 5% in the first 2 wells down to 0% in these last 3 wells. And I get asked a lot of questions as to why we do this. Well, it's really, it's preserving our capital. And so far in this program, but for the totality of the pilot, we'll have saved roughly 75, 80 million US dollars. So just short of our entire market cap. And we don't have to give up a whole lot of that. Yes, we're not going to get a lot of revenue from these first 5 wells, but we are looking and seeing the Beetaloo being proven up, and that's really to what we're all looking to aim and achieve. We talked at previous meetings about the checkerboard. That has now finally been executed and implemented. The checkerboard is a deal between Tamboran and Daly Waters, where at a time before the checkerboard, Daly Waters and Tamboran each owned 38.75% across the entire Beetaloo. And then Falcon had the 22.5%. What the checkerboard has done, and you'll see there on that slide, I'll go to the next slide just to give you a better idea. It's blue and white. So white is Daly Waters and blue is Tamboran. So pretty much all of the white, Daly Waters owns 77.5% of, and Tamboran own nothing of. Falcon has 22.5%. And in most of the blue, but not all of the blue, and ignore the blue to the far right-hand side of that screen in EPs 161 and 136, that's outside of our joint venture area. Most of the blue, Tamboran has 77.5%, but not all of it. So areas like RL10, Daly Waters bought 20,000 acres there. The phase development 2, Daly Waters bought 80,000 acres there. So Daly Waters has a bit of phase 2 at like roughly 20%, and I think they've got 10 or 15% of RL10. So that instead of Tamboran having 77.5, they got 58 of phase 2, and they've got 67 or 68% of RL10, but 77.5% of the rest. And then very importantly is Falcon has 22.5% of all the blue, apart from one small area. If you can see my cursor, is this area here, which is called the North Pilot area. This is the area where we choose to go down to 5% on the 2 wells and then 0. So we're going to have somewhere between 0 to 5% of this. But this South Pilot area down here, where we participated in the first 500-meter well, we did that at 22.5%. So we own 22.5% of that. And we own 22.5% of everything else around the pilot. So that's the checkerboard. And it's kind of put Falcon in a unique position. because now we're the only company that has our foot across the entire Beetaloo. Tambourine are, as I said, only in the blue. Brian is a little bit of the blue and he's mostly in the white, but Falcon is across everything. And that makes us much more attractive for somebody looking to come into the Beetaloo and get exposure across all the Beetaloo and not just one piece of the checkerboard or one half of the checkerboard. So that's created a nice kind of situation for Falcon and has generated a lot of interest from potential players who are looking at coming into the Beetaloo through a farm out that is actively underway. And I'll talk a bit more about that in a second. More recently, also around the same time of the checkerboard, there was the first ever trading of acres. And I mentioned to you in the previous slide where Daily Waters bought 80,000 acres here and 20,000 acres in RL10. They did that at a cost of $15 million US. So that translates to $150 an acre. Now we've got 1 million net acres, as everybody probably knows. So that on paper puts a value of us, and I would call that a kind of a floor valuation of $150 an acre, makes that a valuation of $150 million US. And we're roughly trading at a market cap of about 100 million. So we're well shy, or at least the market price is well shy of what the value is that people are willing to pay for acres. So it's a kind of a nice benchmark. And I think any future deals coming in, that would be the minimum anyone would pay coming into the Beetaloo. And I think it's also opened up the possibility that people now see that the Beetaloo is open for business. It's open for, trading of acres and buying and selling of acres. So we might see a bit more of that in the next year or so. So that's been a pretty good deal where we will see benefit for that, not just in the share price, but also optionality around deals that we ourselves can execute. The other thing that's going on, which is probably significant news and probably the most significant as this continues, is Tambourine's farm down of a particular block, and I'll skip back to the slide here, is this phase 2 development area. It measures 406,000 acres. It's on the market in terms of they are trying to attract somebody to come in and basically carry Tambourine, perhaps Daily Waters, because Daily Waters have what we call tag-along rights to whatever deal Tambourine get. And they're focusing on, all the usual suspects, some of the super majors, the likes of, those that are in country, which would include Shell, ConocoPhillips, and Total. And then a lot of the national oil companies who've all got huge interest in LNG around Australia. So the likes of Petronas, Inpex, the Koreans, Kogas. So I'm sure we're not party to the deal, obviously, but I'd be pretty sure that all of these companies are in the data room looking at the potential to farm into this area. And we don't know what that deal might look like, but it'll probably be something in the order of, rounded numbers, $200 million capex to earn, 200,000 acres in this phase 2 development area. So that would put a net value on that kind of a deal of $500 an acre, significant uplift from the $150 an acre that Daily Waters paid Tambourine recently. We have, of this block being farmed down, 22.5%, nets to 91,500 acres. We're not party to the deal. We don't have a right to participate in the deal. We might be invited to participate, and then we'll have choices to make as to whether we want to participate on the same terms as Daily Waters and Tambourine, or stand our own ground. If it's a big name and the market appreciates the significance of a major coming in here or a super major coming in here, there might be an opportunity for us to raise money and fund our own 22.5%. Or we do what we've done in the last year or so, and we exercise our DSU rights and reduce our capital exposure on maybe the first DSU, but still maintain 22.5%. But no matter what else happens in the next 3 to 6 to 9 months, and who knows how long a farm out might take, but I don't think anything bigger is likely to happen in the Beetaloo in the short term. In terms of the pilot, that's ongoing, and yes, we'll be selling gas by second half of 26. I think that's a significant milestone for the Beetaloo, but there's nothing bigger than if you get one of the big boys to come in here. It's not just, it's a massive endorsement for the Beetaloo, but it'll accelerate the development of the Beetaloo. It'll bring in APA to consider building the bigger pipelines. It'll then attract all the other companies who didn't come into this initial farming. They'll all want a piece of the Beetaloo. So that may happen, who knows, next 3 to 6 months, where Tambourine might be fortunate enough to announce a deal that certainly would excite the market if that happens. So just to kind of, sum up the whole thing, it's a really unique value proposition as we see it in the Beetaloo. We do have as I said, a strategic acreage position. We have lots of now proven commerciality from all the wells that we've tested. We are, as you appreciate, we're running a very capital efficient model by electing various percents of 22.5 to 5 to 0. And to date, I think it saved us about $76 million US. We've got these imminent value catalysts, the biggest obviously being the farm down, progressing the pilot to first commercial gas sales in the second half of 2026. And then we had, the floor valuation of $150. So we're kind of poised for a pretty significant re-rating of Falcon. And significant, way above the $100 or even the $150 per acre I mentioned earlier. This is a summary of the next slide here of the expected news flow activity. So completion of the drilling of 3,000 horizontal wells, which is going pretty well at the moment. So that will hopefully be completed in end of September, somewhere in October. Perhaps Tambourine fracking one of those 3 wells before the end of the year. And then they'll have flow rates on that. That will probably be early Q1 2026. And maybe, at that stage in Q1, maybe to be an announcement of a farm out deal. But as I said, we're not privy to that. And we don't know what the timeline might look like. Completion of the 37-kilometer pipeline by APA by the end of the first half of 2026. And at that stage, then it'll be time for Tambourine to frack the remaining 3 wells that would have been drilled and completed and ready for frack. There's no point fracking them in 25 when there's no gas pipeline to take that gas. But once APA have completed that pipeline, then they will move Liberty back in to complete the fracking of those 3 wells and then hook up those wells, and hopefully we'll be flowing and selling gas to the Northern Territory government by Q3 2026. So a lot going on, and it's pretty exciting times. Just to finish up on a couple of slides, a lot of questions I always get about commodity prices in this part of the world and where are they going. I have no idea where they're going. But all I can tell you is from everything we're hearing and everything we're seeing, we're looking at roughly 12, 13 Aussie dollars per MCF, which translates to about $8.5 US per MCF, and that compares to roughly $3, $3.20 on the Henry Hub US gas prices. So this is a really, really favorable market to be operating in. If we get these kind of flow rates and these high EURs of 12 to 18 BCF per well, and your commodity prices is $8.5, $9 US, that's a place everybody will want to be. There's no doubt about that. And then, finally, we always talk about the value proposition. We are so far over to the left here still, despite all the positives we've had over the last 12 months alone, and all that we expect in the next 6 months, 9 months, 12 months. We are, in terms of valuation, we are still so far over to the left. When you look at where we are in terms of we're finished with exploration, we're finished with appraisal, we're now development, producing, and soon to be selling gas. Not across the entire 4.6 million acres, but there has to be a re-rating coming fairly soon based on everything that's going on. And certainly, I don't think you're going to recognize this company in 12 months' time. By the time, hopefully, we'll have a new big player in, we'll be selling gas, and then we'll be talking about the next big drilling phase and then building the pipeline to take this gas to the East Coast. So a lot of good, exciting times. And I'll just finish up with the final slide, just a quick corporate information. As I said, market cap 100 million, cash at the end of last June, which was $4.8 million US. So we still manage our cash pretty well and have done so for the last 12 months, and we will continue to do so. So I'll hand that back over to Mark in terms of any pre-submitted Q&A, and we can hopefully have some good Q&A session.
That's great. Thank you, Philip, very much indeed. Ladies and gentlemen, please do continue to submit your questions just using the Q&A tab situated on the right-hand corner screen. And ahead of going into the Q&A session, I'd just like to remind you, a recording of this presentation, along with a copy of the slides and the published Q&A, will be available from your investor dashboard. We've got a number of questions that are coming in live that kind of will be covered by some of these pre-submitted questions. So let me jump straight into it, if I may, Philip. What do you see what are Falcon's funding options at the end of this year and perhaps early into next year? Do you prefer other forms of financing to dilutive share issues? And what are your thoughts around other alternatives?
Yeah, great question. And yeah, we don't like dilutive forms of raising money, particularly looking to raise money at the current share price will be considered to be pretty dilutive. We did so in the past last year at 6p. There comes a point in time where you have to raise money and you've got to take money, whatever the market is willing to give it to you. But look, as the Beetaloo continues to progress, there'll be other ways and other funding options available to Falcon. Yes, it could be a straight equity issue. It could be an issue to a strategic investor who might want to build a bigger position in Falcon. So by that, I mean, a family office or private equity fund who doesn't just want to put in 10 or 20 million, but wants to put in 10 or 20 that he can have the ability to follow that investment to become a significant minority shareholder. And that would be something that would come at a premium to the current share price. And then you'd have some serious, investor in our corner over time, which would be, something we are working on in trying to land and find a strategic investor. And then obviously then, with the trading of acres that happened in May, there's also that opportunity that we could find an opportunity that somebody wants some of Falcon's acres across the Beetaloo. And we have 1 million acres. So, we could trade some of those acres for, $150 an acre or slightly better than that. So we have options open to us, and we'll explore those as time goes on.
I guess just drilling down into that, what are your financing needs for 2025 and 2026?
Again, yeah. So, that question again, people say, well, look, are you sure you don't need any money because you're gone to zero? And well, look, despite the fact that Falcon has been, I would consider pretty successful in managing our capital exposure to the Beetaloo, not just today and yesterday, but like for the last 15 years, due to a combination of multiple carries and more recently reducing our participation interest in specific wells, we still have exposure. And, we've exposure to development of the Beetaloo, particularly as it relates to infrastructure, like gas pipelines. We don't have exposure to gas gathering and compression. That's on Daly Waters and Tamboran. But we've also got general license maintenance costs. So road maintenance, abandoned wells maintenance, and so forth and so on. So our financing needs, as I look out into 25 and into 26, they are manageable. And certainly, when you compare to the hundreds of millions of dollars being invested by our JV partners over the last year to two and into next year. But look, we will look to financing options, as mentioned in my previous answer, and ensure that we are more than adequately financed through to the end of 2026.
Thank you very much, Philip. Let's just move the gears slightly. With 2 commercial wells now completed, is management considering a sale or strategic transaction, since exploration companies often look to monetize at that stage?
You're right, they do. You kind of want to time that exit, if you like, at a point in time where you don't get on the big production treadmill. But I think maybe first thing I might point out, actually, we don't consider ourselves an exploration company anymore. We spent the earlier years back in 2012, 13, 14 doing the exploration. And then subsequently, we did a lot of appraising. But look, now the Beetaloo is going into production. So our time for exploration and being considered an exploration company is well and truly over. But, your question in terms of, you're absolutely right. Management is always looking at, strategic alternatives. And the more success we have in the Beetaloo, as I said earlier, the more options we're going to have. I think the real options for any strategic transaction, and by that I mean, somebody coming in to acquire Falcon's interest, or to acquire an option over Falcon's interest, or participate along it. I mean, that'll become much more obvious, let's say, on a successful farm out by Tamboran, particularly if that farm out is to, like I said, a super major. And then, of course, you've got, the second half of 2026, we start selling gas to the Northern Territory Government, 40 million scuffs of gas a day. I think that's going to open up more opportunities in terms of strategic alternatives for the company. And to be honest, we know, there are a lot of companies looking at getting into the Beetaloo. Now, we're not party to the farm out process at all, but I just know from anecdotal comments being made or other evidence I'm picking up that there are a lot of companies looking to come in here. And the super majors I've mentioned who are already in country, and the national oil companies I've mentioned who are already in country, and they all have one thing in common. They all want more molecules of gas. They all have LNG offtakes. They all want that gas so they can take their gas and export it across and home to their countries, whether that be Malaysia or Japan or Korea or Thailand. So I think we're going to have a lot of opportunities over the next 12 months. And all it will take is just one company to finally say, okay, I'm in. And then you're going to see a scrambling, I think, for acres in the Beetaloo.
Thank you. What defines how much acreage Falcon gives up when a drill in a new area and Falcon takes a 0% interest, specifically whether Falcon would lose 6,400 acres or 20,000 acres?
So again, as a question I get asked very frequently, and it's based on drill spacing units, DSUs. And most DSUs measure 6,400 acres, with exception of about 5 of them, where the wells that were drilled, if they're new commitment wells in new areas, they can create a higher area DSU, and that can be 20,000 or actually as big as 25,600 acres. But there's only 5 of those. So, for example, the 500-meter well, the SS1H well we drilled, that was a government commitment well. It was a 20,000-acre DSU that was created then. And Falcon, we own 22.5% of that DSU. The SS2H well, for example, that was drilled more recently at the end of last year, that also was a government commitment well. And it too created a 20,000-acre DSU. So we got 5% of that one. The current well program is going to be in a new DSU, and if these wells are greater than 2,500 meters, then that will perhaps create a DSU size of the max 25,600. And then that's it. That's the government commitment wells pretty much exhausted. There are no more government commitment wells. And then every other DSU, and there's about 710 of them, will be a max size of 6,400 acres. So, a related question I get around this one is, how come Falcon has such a great deal and they can manage their capital exposure by dipping in and out of DSUs and, let somebody pay all the money for one DSU and they own the other 717? How did you get such a deal? And yes, it was a negotiation, but it's not just a deal for Falcon. We're, the obvious beneficiaries of it today because we're the ones sitting on the fence. But think about ExxonMobil or Shell in this play. Tambourine will probably rely on the same benefits we're getting today. And then people ask a related question to that is, well, how protected is this, this deal that you have? Can somebody come in and change the terms and all of a sudden you've lost this protection? And the answer to that is absolutely never. I mean, there's a large, I don't know what it is, a 200 or 300 page JOA, joint operating agreement, signed by all parties. You can't change one word of that JOA without the consent of all parties in writing. So what we have is forever. No one can take away the 22.5%, that's for sure. But no one can even vary the terms of which we operate on that 22.5%. So what we have today and what we've exercised in terms of our flexibility, we can do that into the future forever. And then if somebody were, for example, to acquire Falcon in the future, a question often gets asked, will they enjoy the same benefits that Falcon has? And the answer is absolutely yes, because they'll just simply take our position. We'll transfer our interest in the JOA over to them, and then they will assume all the rights and liabilities and obligations that Falcon has. So it's been a, as I said, it's great for us now because we're seeing the benefit of it today in saving, roughly $76 million, but it's not just for us. Daily Waters, versus ExxonMobil, Tambourine versus Shell. I mean, these are big gorillas in the room. You want to have this flexibility. This is why, we got this deal done. It wasn't for us, it's for the benefit of all of us. And it exists and will remain forever. Exxon comes in today, they can't change it. Nobody can. So it is ours forever.
Thanks, Philip. A number of questions around potential exits. Is the exit timeline still on track for 2026? What is your vision and maybe roadmap for exiting?
The exit timeline. Yeah, I chuckle at that one because I've been talking exit timelines probably since 2012. I'm only out by about 13 years. So thank you for your patience. But look, we're always open to an exit, okay? And it's about the right time to exit, but it's also about the right kind of exit. What I mean by that is, somebody came along today, and I asked at the AGM this morning, if somebody came along today and offered us $150 million in cash, would anyone take it? As in like 50% premium to the current share price. And there's unanimous absolutely no. And I said, well, what about if somebody came into the room today and offered us $200 million cash and you're out of the Beetaloo? And there was all the shaking of heads in the room. Absolutely no. So exit, yes, is one thing. Timing is another thing, but it's the form of exit that we might take is something else, where maybe you take an exit in the form of where you get to stay in the game. You take an exit in the form of shares in a company that's in the Beetaloo. But look at what the way I look at it is, what's going to happen over the next 12 to 18 months, hopefully with a successful farm out by Tambourine to a super major and a first commercial flow rate of a 3,000 well and gas sales to Northern Territory government. A combination of all these is going to make the Beetaloo so attractive for a host of interested parties. As I said earlier, especially companies that require and need more gas for their LNG terminals in Australia. And those, INPEX, for example, wishing to even increase their LNG exports back home out of Darwin. And since the other important thing is Not only do we own 22.5% across the entire Beetaloo and almost every single acre in the Beetaloo, not only are those rights ours forever and can never be varied, the other important thing is we own the gas molecules. So where we participate in a well, even if it's operated by Exxon tomorrow, and we pay 22.5% of that well, Exxon cannot dictate where the 22.5% that gas goes to. That's ours to nominate who we want to take that gas. And why that's important is because if you're, a Petronas or a Cogas or an Inpex, your interest in coming into the Beetaloo is to own the molecules. So if you can do a deal with a company that has ownership over those molecules, that's the company you want to deal with. And we do have ownership over those molecules, subject, of course, to the infrastructure. We can't own molecules going to the East Coast, if we want to send those molecules to the north and there's no pipeline. But, that is a really important thing. I get asked a lot by people who are looking at coming in via the Tamboran farm out process. They talk to Falcon, and these are the questions they ask me. One, do we own our acres across all the Beetaloo? Yes. And do we own the rights to the molecules and can dictate who they go to? And the answer to both of those questions is yes. And that gets, people very excited in terms of, So in terms of an exit timeline, and go back to your question, on track for 2026, like I said, it just takes one company, and hopefully the Tamboran farm out is that trigger that would bring one company in, one big company in. And I think once that happens, the floodgates open. And we've seen this across America. Once you've got one in, there'll be a bit of a scrambling around, and people will say, oh, we better get it. We better get some of the Beetaloo before it's all kind of gone in one certain direction to one major player. So is it going to be 2016? Can't say for certain. Could it be 2017? Can't say. I've been saying this for, what am I doing? 13 years. So, but someday I'll be right. And someday it will be next year. And maybe it is next year. So.
Okie dokie. Where are we on the SS4H well? Can it be fixed and might it be fracked before the end of the year?
Yeah, good question. And just to refresh everybody, the SS4H well, that was a 3,000 meter well that we drilled at the end of 2024, just before Christmas. Total measured depth, 6,500 meters with a 3,000 meter lateral section. And then we went to frack it back in middle to end of February. And as we announced on the 25th of February, the fracking operation was paused. They found a stress in a casing connection, and they decided rather than push it any further, they paused the work and the frack, and then they went about repairing that stress fracture in the casing. As far as we understand, that work was carried out successfully, and it was tested as much as one can test it in the field, but the real test will come when they go to frack that well. So I don't know what the order of fracking of the wells in terms of they're drilling 3 wells today and they have this SS4H well. I don't know what the order of the fracking is going to be in 2025. But what I've heard is I think there is certainly a plan to frack 1 well in 2025. So my bet would be that if you're going to frack a well, well, then you're probably going to frack one of the new 3,000 meter wells in 2025. And then when APA say, hey, pipeline is going to be ready, gas gathering compression is nearly done, then you go out and you frack the other 3. So the answer to your question is SS4H well is back on track. It may be fracked before the end of the year, but it's more likely to be fracked as part of the package of wells to be fracked in 2026.
That does take us nicely into the next question we received. Vertical drilling on the 3 new 3-kilometer wells are almost complete. Can you confirm where we are on this, and can you confirm current plans on fracking on those 3 wells?
People have the intelligence people have of our operations telling me the wells are almost complete. I don't even know that, but no, I'm sorry. I can't really comment on specifics of the current drilling program, other than say that, we do get data reports, is everything's going to plan. It's also worth noting, this is the first time, as I mentioned in the presentation material, it's that we're doing this batch drilling being carried out in the Beetaloo. And this involves, drilling, as I said, of sections of the wells in sequence by skidding the rig from, one well to the next and back again. So you drill the top hole section of the first well, skid it over to the second, you drill the top hole of that section, and then you drill the top hole of the third. And then you go back and you drill the intermediate, and then you repeat. So this practice of batch drilling, it's designed, to increase efficiencies, cost savings, operational consistency by applying standardized procedure for each section of the well. So you're drilling each section, you're doing repeat the same thing 3 times before you go on to the next section. So look, I'm sure, because Tamboran always do, they'll update the market when the drilling program is complete. I'm not sure when that's going to be, probably, let's say end of September, somewhere into October. But yeah, that would be a good time to assess how it's going. But so far, all I can tell you, it's going according to plan. The second part of your question, I think I touched on in the presentation. But yeah, we fracked a single well in 2025 and probably one of those 3 new wells that we'll frack, as I said earlier.
And might the market receive 30-day fracking results on at least one well before the end of the year?
Yeah, probably not. Being realistic, again, I don't know the timings are. I mean, no one knows the exact timing. We finished the drilling program in September, October. By the time you get set up for fracking, you're looking at fracking in October, November. It'll be about 30 days to frack, and then obviously you want to shut the well in for 30 days. So you'll be looking at November, December into January. So yeah, I think it's probably best to estimate an IP30, which would be the plan, by the way, just for this one 3,000 meter well. We don't need to keep doing IP30s. I think that's important to remember. This might be the last IP30 we'll ever do, because what are you trying to prove? But I think at the market and the industry and the APAs of this world, I think they would like to see an IP30 from a 3,000 meter well that we haven't done before. But as I said, it's unlikely to be by Christmas and more likely to be somewhere in early Q1 2026.
Thanks, Philip. Where do we stand politically in the NT and Australia as a whole?
Good question. Look, Northern Territory government, they've been really supportive of oil and gas exploration in the territory, for the past several years. And, we, Tamara and Daly, we're really grateful for this support. And it's been hard, but very well earned. And a lot of this is in large part due to the ongoing efforts by our JV partners, in particular Tamboran and Daly Waters, but also our neighbours, Beetaloo Energy, formerly known as Empire. They invest a huge amount of time, resources, people in the Northern Territory, making sure that we've got not just support from the Northern Territory government, by the way, but support from all stakeholders in the Northern Territory, which is critically important. In terms of federal government support, I mean, I think everyone is very obvious that, Australia has got an energy crisis. And I think pretty much everyone in federal government, appreciates that gas is considered the transition fuel of choice, partly because of its lower carbon intensity, its flexibility for power systems, its global infrastructure capability and compatibility. And of course, I think federal government is well aware of as I said, the energy crisis they are facing, particularly on the East Coast. And as at the presentation, I showed you those gas prices. They're only going to go one way, and they're going to keep on increasing. So their support for the Beetaloo, so any gas that can be delivered from the Beetaloo, it's going to go a long way to alleviating, their ever-increasing crisis. So yes, support at both levels of government, not just Northern Territory, but federal, is very good and has never been stronger. And with the work ongoing by our partners, we hope that continues.
Great, thank you very much indeed. There was a lot of talk last year, and more importantly recently, comments stroke speculation in the industry press that there was significant potential for cost savings in our drilling programs. And what progress are you making on this?
Yeah, look, it's still early days, honestly, but the evidence so far on this current program I'm talking about, has been really encouraging. This current batch drilling, I think hopefully it'll demonstrate that we're well on the road to significant cost savings, and also lessons learned by our operator Tamboran. Hopefully, usually when they put out press releases on drilling campaigns, they often put out, the cost of the drilling. So we might get a good idea, when they announce the completion of the 3-well program, what the cost of this program are. But I think the evidence so far is pretty encouraging. On the other side of things, the other big cost saving outside of the drilling, is on the fracking side, particularly from sourcing sand locally. I don't know if everyone appreciates, but the sand for the last well that was fracked was taken all the way from the United States of America. So you can just imagine the cost of that sand versus sourcing sand locally. So the combination, there's lots of stuff that will happen over time. And it will take a little bit of time, but the cost savings are going to keep coming, and they've come from many, many years. And when you have oil field services companies like the Schlumbergers and the Halliburtons and the Baker Hughes, and they all set up shop in the Northern Territory, not 2,500 kilometers away where they currently are, that in itself, because it cuts so much time if they're close by, that's going to be a huge contribution to more cost savings.
Okay. The Australian domestic market for gas is becoming increasingly tight. Where are you on pricing on supply gas from the Beetaloo to the Northern Territories or other parts of Australia? And are the export markets continuing to be positive?
Yeah, so I think I've answered most of that question. So domestically, Australian $13, US $8.50. LNG, continues to be pretty robust and pretty strong, and that's also reflected in the prices, the price we look at there is what's called the JKM, the Japan Korean market, and that tends to be around like $18 an MCF. So that market is pretty strong and pretty healthy, and is likely to stay that way for quite a while. You know, when I look at, when I talk to particularly national oil companies around Australia, you know, their appetite is to get into the Beetaloo to get molecules for the LNG export market back to, as I said, Malaysia, Japan, Korea. And that's not going to change no matter what else happens. So it's the market for both, you know, on the domestic side, but also the export is very strong and looking likely to stay that way.
Thank you, Philip. At what point does somebody address the Valkyrie C shale? Years ago, you indicated it was basically a flip of the coin as to which formation to drill. The story could get much more exciting along with greatly increasing Falcon's acreage value if someone would complete the Valkyrie C and combine both the B and C horizons.
Yeah, look, there is great potential. You know, back in our early days of drilling, and I'm going back way to like 2015, we drilled and we logged the C, the B, and the A shale. And yeah, we had to kind of like figure out which do we think has got, you know, one is the thickest, but only marginally was B that much thicker than C. So we landed on going after the B, and we've been in the B ever since. But, you know, the person who asked the question is absolutely right. You know, at some stage in the future, somebody's going to address the C shale. That's not going to be tomorrow. I mean, you know, they can always go after the C whenever they want. Right now, we got to focus on what we know and what we've been drilling and everything about the B shale. And there's so much to go after in the B shale right now. No one wants to kind of get distracted by, oh, let's see, can we do a dual completion on a B and a C? Well, why would you want to do that? Let's see, can we start drilling, completing 3,000 meter wells first and do that successfully over and over and over again. And then, only then, you know, 2 years from now, 3 years from now, are people going to go after the C shale? So I think, you know, the question might be alluding to the fact, can we today capture value in the C shale if we were to exit tomorrow? And, you know, the answer is not really, but it does get people excited when they look at the Beetaloo. And they look at, you know, this concept of a stacked play, which is not uncommon in the United States. And you can imagine the economies of a well of, you know, where you got dual completion of two zones in the same well, the cost dynamics of that and the commerciality of that and the return you're going to get on a well with two completions. Not only are you going to get massively increased reserves, but you're going to get massively increased return on your operations. So, but as I said, it's not for today or tomorrow, but in 2-3 years' time, yeah, people are going to go after the C shale for certain.
And then maybe you could address the reverse split and US listing. A number of questions around that. Perhaps you just give a bit.
Yeah, reverse split we call a share consolidation. So like we have 1 billion shares. At the AGM today, we renewed shareholder approval to do an up to 250 for one consolidation, should we ever choose to. But look, I mean, I would approach a share consolidation reverse split very, very, very cautiously. We'd only do it for the right reason and at the right time. And our main reason for doing it would be if we find a US strategic investor. And this investor would prefer that we were a US listed company, even though we're on the TSXV and on the AIM. And if we then decide, okay, we want this investor on board, well, to go onto the US market, you cannot go onto the US market as a penny stock. So we'd have no choice but to do a reverse split stock share consolidation. But that's not happening today. If it does happen, yes, we will certainly look to it. If we have a US-based investor who wants us on a US stock exchange, well, that's, you know, the permission we had renewed at today's AGM. But right now, there are no plans right now to do this reverse split, or in fact to do a US listing. But that could change if I get a US investor who, as I said, wants in, but wants US paper, not Canadian or London quoted paper.
Well, look, thank you very much indeed, Philip. We've got a number of other questions from Craig, Keith, Patrick, Nigel. I can see all your questions are in there, so they're not ignored. It's just I think we've covered a lot of those topics, and maybe, Philip, I can present these to you post today's meeting, and I can publish those out.
That'd be great. Thank you.
Look, I know investor feedback will be important to you, and I will shortly redirect those on the call to give you their feedback. But I wondered if I may just ask you for a couple of closing comments, and then, as I say, investors will be free to give you their thoughts.
Thank you. And again, look, thanks for everybody. You know, I think we've probably got, you know, 200 to 300 people on this call. And, you know, we greatly appreciate this participation. I think it's a great forum that I can, you know, get to share an update. But, you know, what I would say to you, and again, being on this call, I'm going to assume most of you are invested already in Falcon. And if you are an investor, I can honestly say there's probably never been a better time to actually consider increasing that investment. There's so much good news coming. I can't see any bad news on the horizon. It's not like we're going to drill a dud well, because that's kind of hard to do. But we've got so much good news on the horizon, from drilling 3 wells, fracking a well, getting into gas sales next year. Yes, the big news is a farm out that hopefully will happen too. But yeah, this is such a great time that, if you are an investor, and thank you for your patience for being an investor, because it's been a long journey for a lot of you. But this might be a great time to even consider increasing that investment. I don't think you'll get a better opportunity. So thank you all so much.
Thank you, Philip, for updating investors. If I could please ask investors not to close this session, as we'll now automatically redirect you for the opportunity to provide your feedback in order that the company can better understand your views and expectations. This may take a few moments to complete, but I'm sure it'll be greatly valued by the company. On behalf of the management team of Falcon Oil and Gas, we'd like to thank you for attending today's presentation, and good afternoon.